Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're from. I am joined today with my friend and colleague, Dave Russell. Good morning, Dave.
Hey, hey.
We mean that. No matter where you are in the world, we love hearing from each and every person who's on. We're getting roughly 1,000 views in these first hours, so please pile on to the LinkedIn thread. Tell us where you're from, and our goal is to kind of share some experience with you and some perspectives, not necessarily from Veeam, as far as what's going on in data protection and the IT world. This week, we're going to talk about IT modernization in the second half of 2020. Certainly, none of us, our IT modernization plans for the second half of the year look like what they originally were planning on when you did your budgets back in November and December of last year. But we do have some data from the enterprise research report that we're just about to publish. This was 1,500 unbiased enterprises. They didn't know who was doing the survey work. There was a third party that did all the work for it. And these were all enterprise, 1,000 users and up. And we asked them lots of different questions. And because Dave and I used to be analysts, we love data. And so let's look at what that first slide looks like. And we asked two different questions in this report around IT modernization inhibitors. Now, on the left, we asked a question on what are the data protection challenges or data management challenges that your IT team is experiencing. And you can see the blue or green is they can check all that apply. The brighter green is check the one that's most impactful. Now that's the data protection side. On the right-hand side, we asked, what is slowing down your digital transformation initiatives? In fact, if you haven't, please check out last week's LinkedIn stream. We spent the whole half hour talking about digital transformation and what that really looks like and how that might be actualized. Now, Dave, there's a couple macro themes we can take out of these inhibitors between the two sets of data. What were your first thoughts when you saw this?
Yeah, you're right, Jason. There are some repeating themes here, and certainly staffing, even in a pre-pandemic kind of a experience, was high on the list for both, meaning both data protection, data management challenge, as well as inhibitors for digital transformation. Budget always plays a role. Money is certainly, something that gates resources. But those two consistent themes were certainly there. But I know you also like to look at the converse of this equation as well.
Yeah, those little red boxes on the bottom. So when researchers ask questions like this, they typically let you do a none of this applies, right? And that's an exclusive choice. And other than that, you can choose as many as you want of the other green bars. So I always think it's interesting when you look at from a data protection, data management, 11% of organizations said they have no data protection challenges at all, right? Now, the Southern in me from the US would say, bless their hearts. They don't know what their problems are. I think that's a point of naivety. But even if they're right, even if 11% of organizations don't have any challenges, that's 1 out of 9. That means 8 out of 9 IT organizations say that data protection is causing them challenges, right? You can make the same case on the right-hand side. I think that 16% said that nothing is holding back their digital transformation. That'd be 1 out of 6, right? So that means 5 out of 6 organizations recognize that there are hindrances to their digital transformation. And just going back to what you said, Dave, it's if you were to look the converse of lack of staff and lack of budget and lack of modern resources, you could make the argument then if staffing wasn't an issue, if you were spending less time managing backups, right? If legacy hardware wasn't an issue because you were embracing software defined, then you could solve the other problems from IT modernization on the left. You could move forward with your digital transformation on the right. And so I think that's the way that we look at that is if you could remove these obstacles, then you could get to the parts of IT that you really want that would actually make more difference to the business. Dave, does that ring true for you as well?
Yeah, I think so. And now's probably a good time to double click on what modern protection looks like.
Yeah, so in the same survey, we asked folks, what would you consider to be the defining aspects of this? And again, in the bluer style of green, they could check as many as they wanted. And then in the brighter green, they could check, what was the most important. And I think this slide it's one of my favorites in the research study because it actually tells two very different stories. Right. So if you look at for the most common responses, this is kind of like looking at what's the percentage of folks that voted a certain way per person, and then looking at it again per county. And you can actually see some very interesting different meta trends that come out of that. In this case, what we see is modern looks cloudy. Right. And what I mean by that is look at those top 5 responses: the ability to use DR in the cloud, the ability to move workloads to a cloud, to move workloads from one cloud to another. Right. Those top 3 responses, all of them, roughly 50% or more of respondents said modern looks cloudy. Is that a surprise to you, Dave?
Well, it is and it isn't. The part where it's not is it certainly we've been talking about cloud for a long period of time. I think the difference now is that the migration and exploitation of cloud services is certainly on the rise. And if I had one word in addition to cloudy, I would kind of characterize this particular survey response from, it would be integrations, meaning integrate with automation solutions, integrate with cloud capabilities and services, integrate with cybersecurity solutions. So it's really, I think, recognition of a larger need to basically further embrace different kind of delivery models, but also expanded ways that we can leverage our data protection capabilities and integrate and provide more value to the business.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And in fact, if we flip to the other view of that data, if we go to the second lens on that, what you'll actually see is, in this case, we resorted the data based on what was the most important aspect of cloud. And there, to Dave's points, you can see exactly that. The number 1 response actually is the ability to automate workflows orchestration, right? The second one is to do disaster recovery, which again really lends itself to automation. The ability to embed backup within systems management. I actually really like that one because I foresee a world where we look at backupless backup. And what I mean by that is I don't want the IT administrator of the future to go into a systems management framework to provision some workload and then to leave that framework and go over to a backup UI and then say, okay, now I need to protect that workload I just created. Because more and more in this abstracted virtualized infrastructure we have on-prem and cloudy, that should not be the case. So instead, when I provision a workload, that's the right time to define an attribute of protection like a tag in a VM. And then systems management and your provisioning framework should take over from there, right? I should be able to say, hey, I provision a workload and it's gold, silver, or bronze, and backup just happens from that. So the idea of being able to automate and orchestrate, the ability to integrate that as part of cybersecurity, right? That's in fact, Dave, I think we've got another session on ransomware and where backup fits within cyber coming up, and I know Rick's got one too that we should make sure to plug later as well. But yeah, that's what modern looks like is being part of a broader ecosystem and not a standalone island of IT responsibility.
Yeah, I think another thing to kind of observe from the responses here is if you look at particularly at the darker green bar, meaning the one where you're able to select anything that you would like, there was really nothing that was non-selected, deselected, meaning the lowest response was really around cost reduction, alternative consumption models. And that was at 34%, or roughly 1/3. Look at everything else that's in the 40s, even high 40s, or nearing 50%. So it really shows that while we're over half a century into this as an industry from a availability perspective, that the notion of doing this differently, perhaps doing this better, doing this through other platforms or consumption models, and integrating with really an expanding menu of different solutions within the data center or that are offered as a service is certainly very much, in top of mind. I mean, this is something that you have to do, meaning good hygiene is you have to protect the data. Yep. But I think everyone's looking for what else can we do with that? How else can we leverage that? Is there a way to improve upon how we're doing things today? I think we've got some room to grow. The good news, though, is that there's a healthy appetite, it looks like, to better leverage data once we capture it.
Dave, you bring up a really good point in that of this entire stack of what does modern look like, cost actually was the lowest ranking item in that list. We've asked other questions in the past, and you and I have asked this for years and years, and other research back when we were on the other side of the aisle. And when we ask folks about, what would have you change, right? So what are those drivers for a buying behavior? Cost is almost always among the top two or three, right? So they're trying to reduce their economic model, and yet when it comes to what does modern look like, right? What they're looking for is they're looking for outcomes that they don't have today. Right? So the ability to leverage DRaaS, the ability to move data into a cloud, so hybrid and live migration, the ability to stop being in the backup business, by letting backup be managed by systems management and by provisioning frameworks. And certainly we've seen some fantastic cloud providers and what they're doing for backup, where you never even open up a Veeam UI. You just provision a workload and say protect it, and then the cloud provider goes goes from there. So anyway, so I just find that really interesting that cost was really not it.
Yeah, you're right. And I do want to highlight a comment that Douglas made. He said, I find it interesting that, quote, modern discussion, ransomware isn't listed in the survey. It is in these results here. It's number 4 on this list in terms of top ranked. And then pretty high up, it's tied for number 3 on the list of most voted for, meaning ability to integrate data protection with comprehensive cybersecurity solutions. We'll tell you that when we asked on this same survey, what was the top concern you had as a not even data protection professional, but an IT perspective, the top concern was cyber.
Yeah, absolutely. So it does get cut off. It says cyber dash in there, and certainly at Veeam we talk a lot about where does data protection fit within a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy, right? So one thing I always used to poke on backup vendors about back before I joined Veeam was, please don't tell me that your backup solution should be part of cybersecurity because you can restore data. Right? Because restoring from a virus isn't that much different fundamentally than restoring from an earthquake or a forest fire or physical theft, except in all of those cases, the data that you most likely want to recover is the last known version. If you have an infection, the last copy backed up is almost assuredly not the one that's going to solve your recovery goals, right? So the ability to actually integrate in and also provide telemetry for whether or not we actually think a virus has now invaded the system. How do you ensure that you're not backing up infected data? How do you ensure that you don't restore infected data? So yes, it's absolutely in there. In this particular survey, that was the 4th highest demarcation as far as what does modern look like. Hey, let's look at cloud though. So because everything else we said was in cloud, and I want to watch for time today. This is actually not from the survey that Veeam contracted for, but this is actually from an ESG survey from 5 years of how are folks using the cloud. And I always put that in quotes because there's not a cloud per se. But I do think it's really interesting that when they published their 2019 data, that's last year that I saw this point for, 49% of organizations said they plan on running production in the cloud, right? And you can look at that blue line on the right. You can see how the interest in production has gone from 27%, 1 out of 4 orgs, up to 49%, 1 out of 2 orgs over that 4-year window. Meanwhile, for most organizations, one of their first forays into cloud was leveraging it as a archive or backup repository. That's the light green line that you see there, and that's pretty consistent, 49 into 40s all the way through. And or using the cloud for DR, that's the red line, and that stays pretty flat also. About a third of organizations, 35 4 years ago, 37% now. two things I love about this particular set of data over time. Anyway, in general, I love data over time because I love the trend lines and what that means. In this case, you do see that pivot where around 2017, organizations said, you know what, I'm going in cloud, right? That really was that pivot that we saw where the primary use case was going to pivot through. The other thing that I think is interesting is because cloud fits in a data protection model in two ways. If you look at the second lens of this data, there's a bright green line that'll pop up in just a second. This is custom. These are organizations that chose either the light green, use it as a backup repository, or the red line, use it for DR. And we consistently see roughly 60%, give or take, 3 out of 5 organizations said the cloud is going to be part of their data protection strategy, and that stays relatively flat over a 5-year period. So I think those are some of the interesting things. But the title of this session was, what does IT modernization look like in the second half of 2020? And Dave, if I had a crystal ball, I think I'd be betting on a hockey stick up for anything cloudy for the latter half of this year.
Yeah, I think I would very much agree with you, and for multiple reasons. One has to do with moving more towards an OpEx model from a cost basis versus CapEx.
Yep.
So there's a lot of financial constraints that, while cost from the survey that we just showed some things from a little bit ago was not top of mind at end of 2019, it increasingly is going to raise in importance, I think, second half of 2020. The other aspect, though, is that when we look at this, it's in part going to want to be able to make sure you're better protected, that you've got geographic distance for your safe copy of the data. So there are economic reasons, there's availability reasons, and there's might just be flat out, we don't have the equipment or the ability in-house to do this. That in part could speak to skills, in part could speak to infrastructure. So the need to be able to better leverage, other resources. I mean, the old joke is, what's the cloud? The cloud is someone else's data center, perhaps being run with or augmented by someone else's resource, meaning engineers. That is probably going to become more pronounced in the second half of this year than what we've ever seen before.
And let's talk about the practicality of deploying new projects in the second half of 2020, right? Because the reality is that for the last 2 months, most of the IT professionals that I know could not walk into their own data centers.
Yes.
Right. So any project that required rack and stack of I've got new gear coming in, I'm going to go ahead and put that in and start running it. Right. Those projects are on hold because you can't rack and stack. And I'm looking at between social distancing and, oh, by the way, summers are coming up for a lot of folks. I don't see rack and stack coming back onto pace anytime soon. So if your projects were rack and stack based, they're still on hold, probably at least into Q4, maybe into 2021, right? As opposed to anything that you could do that is on a software-defined or a cloud-based infrastructure that's fluid, right? Some of the IT professionals that I've talked with have actually said they have started accelerating those projects. If they were moving 2,000 mailboxes a month onto Office 365, now it's 4,000. If they were looking at how to deprecate their tape or to deprecate their offsite copies, that's accelerating, because that's the stuff that you can do in your pajamas sitting on a couch while still working in IT without having to rack and stack kit. Does that ring true with who you're talking to on the CXOs?
Yeah, it does. We've kind of alluded to software defined, and I think, coming up in a future episode of Industry Insights, let's double click a little further on the notion of software defined overall. But, I think what we're increasingly going to experience is exactly what you mentioned, that the new activities and modernization efforts that are at least primarily predicated upon rack and stack, bringing in new gear, are going to be challenging, going forward. I think there's going to be a lot of hang on to the infrastructure that you've got while simultaneously trying to transition into either improved services or new services. But Jason, no relation. There's a comment here It says, not to mention supply chain is so packed right now, nothing is going to even be delivered for physical rack and stack for quite some time. And that's a really good point. And if
That's
I think I know where Jason's going, but I'll take that even further, meaning, assume that you've got a finished goods, a to use something or other.
yeah.
Well, that's hard to get delivered, but the individual components from, say, super micro server to, whatever WD and Intel, HDDs and SSDs and various other components, all of that is, very, very constrained right now. Though there's some evidence that some of that is freeing up, but it's still not at the predictable levels we were at. So I think it's a good point that Jason makes there.
That's a really good read. I mean, every part of that supply chain has to slow down, from components to servers, from servers to distribution. Even when it makes it to your dock, which week are those folks in the dock going to be raising it up to your floor? And then you've got to go in and rack and stack it, versus raise up that credit card, stand up an Azure kit, stand up an AWS kit, and start moving on what else you're doing. So I think there's some really interesting points there. We got one last data point to share just to kind of round out for the time today. Keep the questions coming though, but
yes,
this was actually a survey point that came in before the pandemic that we had. And this was looking at what is going to be your primary backup method. And so if we can bring that last chart up, we asked organizations two questions, mostly related. First one is, how much of your data lands in each of these kinds of different data protection repositories? That's on the left. 18% not backed up, not quite sure why. About a third are self-managed, all on-prem, nothing leaves the building. About a fourth, the data cloud managed. It's going to be self-managed, but the data ends up in a cloud. And then about a fourth, the data is being managed by a BaaS provider as part of that. But then look at, and the colors line up, by the way, when organizations were asked, what do you anticipate being your organization's primary method of backup in 2 years? Cloud went from 24% of data today to 43% of organizations said that cloud via a BaaS provider is their expected primary method. And in fact, if you look on the right-hand side between a BaaS provider, 43%, or self-managed but using the cloud. So I think that's the difference between BaaS is the first option, Azure Blob or S3 storage is the second option. But either way, you're at 77%, if my math is right. 3 out of 4 organizations recognize the cloud's going to be there. And my guess is that's low. In the new world, as far as how cloud adoption is continuing to accelerate, my guess is that's low.
Yeah, great point. As we wrap up, I do want to give a quick send ahead to our colleague Rick Vanover. He's going to have a show this Friday at 12 p.m. United States East Coast time. It's very topical. Rick is going to comment on, with working from home having changed where data is created, the need for endpoint backup and being a critical part of your personal as well as your business protection plan is only increased dramatically. Rick's going to unpack that this Friday, 12 p.m. US Eastern. And to take us out, Jason, I think we should give a shout out to VeeamON 2020 coming up in June.
Yeah, if you're enjoying the talks that we're doing, also the ones that our product strategy colleagues are doing midweek as well, please join us on June 17th and 18th. We have 2 full days of great experiences, morning, afternoon, depending on your time zones around the world, to bring a lot of this insight to you in a much more condensed version. So we'd love to have you. Go to veeam.com/VeeamON to register, and we will see you next week and then again in June.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, stay positive. Over and out.
Take care.